easy.
Half of everything is luck, James.
And the other half? Fate.
Few things in cinema feel as fated for one another as James Bond and Christopher Nolan. A self-professed mega-fan of the long-running series, Nolan's filmography almost plays like an extended audition to make a Bond film, with homages to the famed 00 agents sprinkled throughout. Some understated, like the little nod to On Her Majesty's Secret Service at the climax of Inception, and others, well, less so. Like just about every other thing that happens in Tenet or the Dark Knight trilogy. Likewise, Nolan's influence on the latter half of the Craig era is pretty hard to ignore, with Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die all taking cues from the legendary director's filmography, particularly in relation to their tone and themes. Sam Mendes himself even cited Nolan directly when discussing his approach to Skyfall. What Nolan proved was that you can make a huge movie that is thrilling and entertaining and has a lot to say about the world we live in. The Dark Knight felt like a movie that was about our world post 9/11 and played on our fears and discussed our fears and why they existed, and I thought that was incredibly brave and interesting. That did help give me the confidence to take Skyfall in directions that, without The Dark Knight, might not have been possible. However, despite how intertwined these two juggernauts of the silver screen have become in the public consciousness, their paths have somehow never crossed. A lot of this has had to do with timing. By the time Nolan had made a name for himself in Hollywood, Bond was already in a long-term relationship with Daniel Craig, and although those films are very much in line with his sensibilities for all the aforementioned reasons, they constituted someone else's vision. Over the years, whenever asked about whether he'd do a Bond film, Nolan has always maintained he would only do it if it could be its own thing, a reinvention of the character totally disconnected from the work of other filmmakers. He wanted his Bond to be his, and that simply wasn't achievable midway through an actor's tenure. So when it came time to start thinking about the character's future in the wake of No Time to Die, many assumed it was finally Nolan's moment. Hot off a string of creative and commercial successes and widely considered to be one of the most beloved filmmakers of his generation, it made total sense to bring Nolan on board. There was just one small wrinkle: creative control. Nolan is famous, or if you're a studio exec, infamous for the amount of control he exerts over his productions. He has a hand in every decision from pre-production to post-production, and always insists on being given final cut. Hell, I mean, he's even a stickler when it comes to how his films are exhibited, pushing for wide theatrical releases on premium IMAX screens to ensure his work is experienced in the most optimal environment possible. And while that might be discouraging for studio execs who don't like having their authority challenged, the results speak for themselves. The man knows what the fuck he's doing. In a lot of ways, his approach to filmmaking is a perfect mirror to the way Eon Productions has always gone about making Bond films. Like Nolan, they also favor practical filmmaking and theatrical distribution and demand total control over their productions. The only hitch is, you can't have two parties with total control over a production, as Sean Connery might say.
In the end, there can be only one.
On one hand, you have a director who demands final cut, and on the other, you have a production company unwilling to give it. And therein lies the problem. According to Variety, this disagreement over final cut was the sticking point that ultimately ended Nolan's chance to direct Bond 26. Despite expressing a keen interest in jumping straight into the project following the release of Tenet, Nolan's insistence on complete creative control was a non-starter for Eon, and the negotiations broke down. Nolan moved on to make Oppenheimer, and, we all know how that worked out for him. It was probably about the best thing he could have done, while Bond 26 drifted into limbo, where it remained until just a few weeks ago when veteran producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson officially announced the end of their decades-long stewardship of the franchise, handing complete creative control over to Amazon, which had previously purchased MGM, the distributor of the Bond films, back in 2021. After years of getting nowhere on Bond 26 due to their own creative differences, the retail giant turned film studio turned corporate overlord finally got its way. Or rather, it just, paid him off and bought it. For the low, low price of $1 billion, on top of the $8.5 billion they originally paid for MGM. Amazon finally got its grubby little hands on the keys to the kingdom, and good lord, am I nervous. My exact words when finding out Amazon had creative control over James Bond were, James Bond is dead. Ashes to ashes.
Dust to dust.
Exactly.
Is that a tad dramatic? Yeah, probably, but I'd feel like I was underselling just how bad this is if I put it any other way. Because as fanboy-brained as it sounds, the announcement really did feel like a death in the family. Like Eon Productions and the Broccoli family who run it are baked into the DNA of the Bond franchise. It's not just that they've produced these films over 60 years, although the magnitude of that feat can't be overlooked, it's that their involvement was instrumental in shaping all 25 films made in that span. The Broccolis were far more involved in the creative process than your average producer. They pitched story ideas, they cast actors, they collaborated with directors on set, and they cultivated a loyal crew of in-house artisans and technicians, many of whom have been a part of making these films for decades. To put it another way, they've been the beating heart of these films from the very beginning. There's a famous story about Cubby Broccoli that I think illustrates what I'm trying to get at better than any attempt to wax poetic. While shooting on location in Egypt for The Spy Who Loved Me, the food never showed up.
Being a sort of a cooker in the house, and I do a lot of amateur cooking, I decided I would cook up a big spaghetti do for the boys because I knew they all liked that sort of thing.
So Cubby got in a Jeep with one of the crew, and they went searching for pots and pans and pasta and tomatoes. I
had to fly someone into Cairo to get the spaghetti.
Cubby got in the catering wagon with his other caterers there, and he cooked all the mountains and mountains of spaghetti. This is the producer with an apron on, and he's cooking for the whole unit.
You don't do something like that if you're just a businessman who's in it for the money. You do it because you care about your crew and about the thing you're making. These films weren't just a product for the Broccolis, they were a labor of love, a creative endeavor which they poured their blood, sweat, and tears into right alongside the crew. They respected the legacy they'd inherited from Bond's creator, Ian Fleming, and took great personal pride in getting to continue it. Yes, it was a business, but it was a family business, one that specialized in providing a boutique cinematic experience that has persisted because of the passion emanating from the top. For all their shortcomings, and look, there were shortcomings to be sure, but the Broccolis cared about this character and these films, and they consistently leveraged their ownership to preserve the integrity of the series. When Cubby acquired the rights to adapt Fleming's novels back in 1961, he did so because he genuinely loved the books and saw their potential for the big screen, potential he never stopped trying to realize. Then, when his children took over, they took great pains to expand the character beyond what audiences had come to expect of him. Over their 30 years at the helm, Barbara and Michael courted world-class filmmakers to modernize the franchise and push the boundaries of what a Bond film could be, successfully lifting the series to new heights of popularity. Twice, I might add. And the only reason that was possible was because at no point did they have to answer to corporate ownership. They had a mandate to do what they felt was right for the character, and no temporary people, as Cubby often called them, could tell them no. It feels silly to say considering the scale and scope of these films, but Daniel Craig was absolutely right when he described the James Bond films as the biggest independent movies ever made. But now, all of that is at an end. With Amazon calling the shots, the temporary people have officially taken control of the Aston Martin, and it's hard to see that as anything other than the end of James Bond.
You just killed James Bond!
But you know all that. I did a video ranting about that and going into depth about, why this is a bad idea in this other editorial video. But let's get back to Nolan. What exactly does this have to do with Christopher Nolan? Well, if reporting from The Wrap is to be believed, all of this corporate buyout bullshit might actually be the thing that puts a Nolan Bond film back on the table. According to anonymous insiders who spoke with the outlet, he's Amazon's top pick to helm its first Bond production, and honestly, That's probably the best thing I've heard since the buyout was announced. By far, my biggest concern with Amazon taking control of the James Bond franchise is that it's hard to imagine them making anything but bland, risk-averse films designed to pander to the broadest possible base while showing little to no regard for the artistic integrity of the franchise. It's not that I think Amazon is totally incapable of producing interesting films. I mean, they have in the past, or even that I think Bond films are these pure artistic exercises free of compromise and commercialism. They're not. But all 25 Eon-produced entries had a personal touch to them that will be all but gone now that Amazon is running the show. Where Eon was a small operation free to make creative decisions based purely on what both the producers and filmmakers felt was right, Amazon Studios is a massive corporation. It's a bureaucracy with hundreds of different voices at the table, each vying for a chance to put their stamp on the series and advance their career. I mean, we've seen the memes going around and, the the nice arts that I think Variety commissioned, but like, this is like if James Bond was bought out by Spectre. It's like if James Bond was being run by Ernst Stavro Blofeld. It is nuts. These executives, by and large, aren't looking to try new things, push boundaries, or even flex a creative muscle. They're looking for a return on their considerable investment. Having already spent upwards of $9.5 billion for control of James Bond, it's safe to assume they'd want to err on the side of caution to maximize potential profits. And looking at the way other major studios have attempted to do exactly that with their legacy franchises, that almost always means delivering a steady flow of inoffensive fan service to keep fans placated, with maybe a few spin-offs here and there to open up additional revenue streams. Put another way, they'll want content, and a lot of it fast. Or at least that's my fear, because if the rumors are true and they really are circling Nolan to launch this new era of Bond, it would suggest that Amazon might actually be taking their newfound stewardship of the series seriously. Christopher Nolan is obviously one of the most interesting and acclaimed filmmakers working today, and so bringing him on board would not only demonstrate a commitment to keeping Bond a must-see cinematic experience, it would signal that the Amazon era of Bond need not represent a slide into gratuitous IP exploitation. Eon may have kept a tight grip on Bond, but they consistently showed a willingness to push the envelope creatively and make interesting decisions. And Nolan getting to usher in this new chapter would declare in no uncertain terms that Amazon is willing to do the same as well. Because again, Nolan won't just be a gun for hire. That's never been his MO. He's gonna make the film he wants to make, the way he wants to make it. And if Amazon is willing to give him that latitude, it would earn them a lot of goodwill, not just from concerned fans like me, but from other filmmakers who might otherwise be put off by the franchise's new corporate owners. I mean, recently, directors like Edward Berger, who was speculated to be in contention for directing Bond 26, and The Monkey and Longlegs director Osgood Perkins, have expressed discomfort with the prospect of having to work under Amazon to make a Bond film.
Barbara Broccoli is no longer doing it, and that she's at the heart of this project, so I think it's something different. And I don't know, things have changed. Like, we will certainly miss her very much.
Is that something in a filmmaker's mind in their career going, that would be a moment, that would be a life-changing experience?
It 100% was with Barbara Broccoli. Now it's a different equation, and I don't know what the future is going to look like, and I haven't really thought. I mean, I'm going to think about it if anyone calls me, but, I think Barbara Broccoli is at the heart of this, and if she's no longer there, it becomes a very different thing.
But hiring Nolan, who everyone knows demands complete creative control, would show these filmmakers that they wouldn't necessarily have to sacrifice their artistic freedom to work on Bond, opening the door to all kinds of exciting prospects down the line. In a weird way, taking a chance on a filmmaker like Nolan, which is an insane thing to say because it's not taking a chance, it's actually probably the most sure bet thing you could do, but it would actually help me view Amazon's ownership of the series in a whole new light. Because, for as much comfort as I found in how protective Eon was of James Bond, that insulation has come with undeniable downsides. I mean, it was the reason they passed on Christopher Nolan in the first place, which I think was a huge, huge fucking mistake. It was also the reason Danny Boyle walked away from No Time to Die back in 2018. Eon's total creative control over the franchise helped protect the franchise from excessive studio meddling, but it also scared off a lot of top-shelf talent, many of whom were averse to working with a production company that commands so much creative control over its productions. Amazon will undoubtedly be less precious about the franchise, as it'll inevitably be just one of many projects the studio is producing in a given year. Sure, there will be meddling, but that meddling won't take the form of a constant presence in all stages of production. And while this detachment opens the door to the unfettered contentification of the series, if they opt to hand the keys to a director with a strong creative vision right out the gate, a director like Christopher Nolan, it would actually exemplify the virtues of the studio's less protective attitude towards the character. Rather than maintaining quality by taking an active role in each production, Amazon could lean into the fact that they simply aren't able to be as involved as Eon was and instead delegate that responsibility to its filmmakers. Use their newly acquired creative control in order to bestow that creative control to the artists that want to play with these incredible toys. Of course, Amazon would still be responsible for finding said talent, and who they pick will still come down to whether they like the filmmaker's vision for the series, but once found, they'd be able to offer a level of creative freedom Eon simply wasn't willing to provide. And in doing this, they'd only attract more high-quality talent, starting a cycle that would ensure the franchise continues to produce interesting, high-quality films for years to come. And while Amazon could absolutely achieve all of this by hiring any number of auteur directors, the great thing about Nolan is that he embodies the synthesis of both artistic merit and commercial viability. I don't really need to tell you that Christopher Nolan is an exceptional filmmaker, nor do I need to explain that he's also a massive box office draw. I mean, the man managed to make a 3-hour character study about a physicist in World War II into both a Best Picture winner and a billion-dollar mega hit. With Nolan, Amazon doesn't have to choose between taking a risk on an interesting filmmaker or picking a safe bet, because Nolan is both, without the risk. And that isn't even to mention the fact his films are always on time and on budget, sometimes even under budget. He's literally a unicorn in this industry and the perfect answer to Amazon's current dilemma, which is how to relaunch Bond in the most effective way possible, while also reassuring fans that they won't just turn the franchise into disposable IP slop. And if all of that somehow wasn't enticing enough for Amazon, they already have a working relationship with the man's brother, Jonathan, who's currently showrunning their highly acclaimed Fallout series on Prime. I mean, fuck me, like, you don't really have a better in than that. Add to the fact that MGM's already inked a deal with Nolan's current studio of choice, Universal, guaranteeing them the international distribution rights for the next Bond film, and you have what is quite literally the perfect storm. It's good for Amazon, and it's good for Bond, and it's good for cinema. Plus, Chris would finally get to make the Bond film he's been itching to make his whole life, while helping to ensure the series remains a theatrical experience and not just another soulless, lowest common denominator content farm for Amazon Prime. But then that begs the question, what would a Christopher Nolan Bond film even look like? Obviously, when you say Christopher Nolan Bond film, a few things jump to mind immediately. For one, it'll be shot on IMAX film, likely by his regular cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema, who coincidentally has already lensed a Bond adventure. It'll likely be scored by either Hans Zimmer, another Bond alum, or Ludwig Göransson, and it'll feature a mind-boggling number of incredibly audacious stunts and boast impressive in-camera visual effects. I also think a lot of people assume it'll be a fairly stripped down and serious affair, thanks in large part to Nolan's Dark Knight films, which centered on a more grounded take on DC's Caped Crusader. But while I understand this impulse, I actually don't think it's what we can expect from his Bond film. Firstly, I don't think the Dark Knight films are quite as serious as people make them out to be. Sure, they're more quote-unquote realistic than the Batman films that preceded them, but that's because those films were basically live-action cartoons. And all three of the Nolan films strive for a degree of aesthetic verisimilitude, but they aren't completely grounded in reality by any stretch of the imagination. The first film is about an international cabal of ninjas intent on gassing Gotham City with a fear toxin to induce mass rioting and societal collapse. Meanwhile, the trilogy capper is about a masked man who can punch through solid concrete, cutting the city off from the world and threatening to set off a nuclear bomb. Batman drives a fucking tank and uses a whole bunch of insane future tech in his war on crime. And that's not a bad thing. All I'm saying is that this isn't exactly The Wire. And that's not to mention how funny these movies can be. Just because the films aren't full of ice puns and self-aware meta humor doesn't mean they're overly self-serious. And the same goes for the vast majority of his filmography, for that matter. Nolan makes fun movies, and I'm tired of pretending he doesn't. But more importantly than that, even if his films were as self-serious as people make them out to be, Nolan's favorite Bond movies seem to suggest he isn't interested in taking Bond in that direction anyway. On multiple occasions, he cited On Her Majesty's Secret Service and The Spy Who Loved Me as his two favorites in the series, two films with larger-than-life villains and over-the-top doomsday schemes, not to mention a healthy dose of humor. Sure, On Her Majesty's Secret Service leans more toward reality than The Spy Who Loved Me and places a greater emphasis on its emotional storytelling, but both films are, at the end of the day, far more alike in tone than they are dissimilar. They're big spectacles that take place in a slightly more heightened reality than our own. And when you look at films like Inception or Tenet, it's not hard to see their influence. So I think it's fair to say we could probably expect Nolan's Bond to be more fantastical in scope like those films than people might expect, which would honestly be a welcome change of pace after the more grounded approach of the Craig films. As for who he'd cast as Bond, I mean, it's kind of hard to say. However, for what it's worth, he stated in the past that Timothy Dalton is his favorite Bond actor, so it's possible he'll go for someone similar. A tall, dark, and handsome type, maybe classically trained and capable of conveying great intensity while also possessing a certain Byronic romanticism. More of a traditional gentleman than Craig, but less of a cavalier than Brosnan or Moore. This kind of Bond would certainly suit Nolan's sensibilities, as his protagonists tend to be broody, romantic types, burdened by their past and wrestling with the unpleasant nature of their work. Characters like Leonard Shelby, Cobb, the protagonist, Bruce Wayne, and J. Robert Oppenheimer all have a Fleming-esque quality to them, so it's not hard to imagine Nolan's Bond drawing on the literary character the way Dalton did. Whoever he casts, I have total faith they'd be the right person for the job. I mean, just look at the way he cast the Dark Knight films. Every actor suited the character they were playing to a T. So much so that many people consider them to be definitive versions to this day. And it's safe to say we could probably expect a couple of his regulars to round out the cast. Who makes the cut isn't for me to say, but I can definitely imagine someone like Cillian Murphy or Kenneth Branagh as M, or even the villain. Although, I guess Branagh technically already played a Bond villain in Tenet. I mean, come to think of it, Branagh would also make a pretty good Q, too. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if Nolan makes a Bond film, Kenneth Branagh needs to be in it in some capacity. He's due for some involvement in this franchise. Long overdue, I might add. And Michael Caine. I mean, it would be so fun to have him back in there, too, just because he was so close with Sean Connery and Roger Moore. But then again, I mean, I wouldn't want to replace his touching curtain call in Tenet, but if the possibility of Michael Caine being in a Bond film was on the table, I mean, I wouldn't say no. I wouldn't say no, and it would be fitting if it was a Nolan film. There's also a high probability, nay, inevitability, that Nolan would write the film's script himself, or at least co-write it. There's even a chance he does it with his brother like they did on the latter two Dark Knight films. Although the two haven't worked together since Interstellar, so it's not a sure thing. And although Nolan is known for his mind-bending high-concept stories, I don't think that's what we'd get here. Chances are the stories will be more akin to his Dark Knight films, narratively straightforward but intricately plotted. There might be some of his trademark non-linearity, but I'm not certain he'd go that route. His affinity for Dalton's more emotionally vulnerable take on the character means I wouldn't be shocked if the story is somewhat character-driven, but I don't think it'll be to the same extent as the Craig films, if only because that ground was explored so recently. If anything, we'll probably get a nice synthesis of character drama and high-stakes intrigue. Again, not unlike his approach to Batman or films like Inception or Tenet. Despite his reputation as a cold, emotionally detached filmmaker, Nolan is probably one of the most sentimental directors making mainstream films, and so I have to imagine his Bond film would operate on an emotional level to some degree. As for what the actual plot would be about, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. Films like Oppenheimer, Tenet, and The Dark Knight Rises have demonstrated that Nolan has a healthy fear of nuclear annihilation, while Tenet and Interstellar are largely preoccupied with human-caused environmental destruction and the cause and effect relationship between our actions and our future. So it's possible these ideas work their way into his Bond film. Another theme that has been present across many of Nolan's films, but came to a head in Oppenheimer, is the tension between doing one's job and doing what one believes is morally right. Much of that film centers around Oppenheimer's struggle to square his personal apprehensions about the Manhattan Project with his personal ambition and desire to defeat the Nazis at all costs. Fans of Bond, particularly the literary Bond, can tell you that this mirrors the internal conflict Bond often grapples with, torn between his growing distaste for the nature of his work and the moral imperative he feels to stand against those who threaten his country and the freedom and democracy he believes it stands for. So, given his preoccupation with these ideas, it's not hard to imagine a Nolan Bond film bringing this conflict to the forefront in some way. Then again, I mean, he could also do something completely unlike anything he's ever made before. I'm sure he's been refining this idea for what he'd do for a Bond film for decades at this point, given the fact that he's a super fan. But regardless, I'm willing to bet it'll zero in on a hot-button geopolitical issue like the war in Ukraine or the global rise of fascism. Nolan has repeatedly demonstrated that he isn't afraid to get political with his films, and so I think it's fair to assume he'll go for something quite timely, which is part of why I highly doubt he'll opt to do a period piece Bond, despite what some rumors have suggested in the past. Regardless of my personal feelings on the idea, spoiler alert, I'm not a huge fan, it just doesn't really match his sensibilities as a filmmaker. With the exception of The Prestige, Dunkirk, and Oppenheimer, and I suppose The Odyssey now, Nolan's films tend to take place in the now, or at least the very near future. Moreover, science and technology are frequently a fundamental part of them, and I can't picture him setting those preoccupations aside for the sake of making a period set Bond. The closest he's ever gotten to retro future historical fiction is The Prestige, and in that case, he was adapting a book that was itself written to be a period piece, as opposed to Fleming's Bond books, which were written as contemporary stories that have subsequently become period stories as time marches forward. I might be way off here, but it just doesn't track with everything we know about who Christopher Nolan is as a storyteller. Even when Nolan is making films about the past, he's telling stories about the present. So why would he set the story in the past when there isn't really a reason beyond an aesthetic? The truth is, no one except Christopher Nolan knows what a Christopher Nolan Bond film would look like. But I feel pretty confident in saying it would be very good, if not great. Christopher Nolan is hands down my favorite filmmaker. Big shocker, I know, I've only mentioned it a million times on this channel, and James Bond is by far my favorite film series, and I'd give just about anything to finally see them cross paths after years of circling one another. I can sit here and reiterate the fact that it would be the single smartest move Amazon could make to earn some goodwill from fans and cinephiles alike, are more than a little put off by the fact that this cinematic institution is now a big studio franchise just like every other major franchise in Hollywood. It's for that reason why bringing on Nolan is quite literally the only thing Amazon could do to really win me over in believing in what they're going to do with the James Bond franchise. Similarly, I could keep stressing the fact that a Nolan Bond film is all but guaranteed to be a cultural event that rakes in an ungodly sum of money at the box office. But the real appeal of a Nolan Bond film is simply that it would be a damn good movie. An exciting and innovative piece of filmmaking, a film worth seeing. And regardless of who owns the rights to Bond, that's what this character needs if he's gonna continue to thrive for decades to come.